It is a windy and stormy day here in Munich, but the political storm is yet to come as we get underway at the 62nd Munich Security Conference. Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Great to see you as always.
Great to be back.
It would be nice someday to have good news to talk about,
and
right?
Good weather.
And good weather, actually. Last time we were in a snowstorm together, but appropriately then, I want to start on the Arctic, which has become, and that big, beautiful piece of ice, as Donald Trump described it in Davos, has ironically become one of the hottest political flashpoints, and not just between the US and Europe, but really globally. Why there and why now?
So the US President Trump, I think, has had the right instincts on the Arctic. It is critical to global security, and it's critical to US homeland security, which is obviously a top priority of any US president and a very top priority of this admin. Of course, my preference would be that we work with our allies, not against our allies, to ensure that we can mutually reinforce our national interests and the interests of NATO and the United States, which are actually one and the same if we look at the kinds of global threats we're facing as an alliance, Europe and the United States together. So Greenland factors into this because it is strategically important for Europe, for NATO, for the United States. It is increasingly an area where Russia and China both see their own interests. They may not be aggressively pursuing them yet, but there's no question that the Arctic is an arena of incredible global competition between these so-called great powers. I don't put Russia in the great power category. So the present instances have always been right, but I think the problem has been that for Europeans, the way that President Trump has expressed those interests by alluding to potentially even using force, which he then backed down from, of course, to acquire Greenland, this has really hit a nerve with Europe in Davos, and I don't think it's worn off a few weeks later now in Munich. So I think this is still going to be something very much top of mind for people as we head into the discussions here at the Munich Security Conference.
The point you make about the threat that is present in the Arctic for the whole alliance is real. Russia, for example, has conducted dozens of military exercises there. So what you're saying essentially is NATO should get on board with wanting to better secure the Arctic. Do you think we're going to get to some sort of deal that is acceptable to both sides?
It does seem that way. I think there's always been a deal to be had there, meaning between European NATO member states and the United States. When the President of the United States expresses a deep interest in something, I think it behooves our allies not to react emotionally, even though it's very difficult to do, but to say, okay, how can we get to a deal? It's not going to be exactly what the president wants, but there's a mutual deal to be had here. It is in the European interest to have an Arctic that is secure and doesn't fall into primarily Russian and increasingly Chinese interests. It's fascinating that China now is trying to play in this space as well. So the more that the United States can reinforce and enable our NATO allies to do more, to work more cooperatively, to enhance intelligence sharing, to have more presence, the better off we'll be in the United States, the better off the alliance will be.
So in what ways has China flexed itself in the Arctic? Because I know they haven't had a military presence there.
No. But what we've seen in the last several years, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that China does a lot of its work through Russia, which has obviously become very much a junior partner to Beijing. So Russia pursues Chinese interests in the Arctic. They used to compete more, I would say, than they do now. China has said that it's not an Arctic power, but an Arctic nation in some way. So they obviously see opportunities there, and they're trying to figure out ways that either through Russia and through their support from Moscow or through various other means, they can become a player there in terms of securing their monopoly in critical minerals. That's obviously a big priority, potentially in a future climate, benefiting from opening of various passages from the ice melt. So China very much sees, I think, the Arctic as an area where it should have a legitimate right to play, especially as Russia becomes more of a junior partner to Beijing.
Do you think in general President Trump's approach has strengthened NATO or weakened NATO?
It's a great question. I think it's a bit of both. I know that's not a clear answer, but it really is. On the one hand, we've seen Europe finally step up. We're seeing defense spending going up. It is true that the Hague Summit, I think, was a huge success because we had European allies finally commit to this mixed but essentially 5% defense spending, historic. And it's true that Europe has known they had to do this for a long time, but they have never taken the steps because it's just easier to stay with the status quo where you have the United States provide European security. So that's been a big development, and that has made NATO stronger. The more NATO allies spend on defense, the more they take it seriously, the better the alliance is as a whole. Germany has stepped up in a particularly significant way. In terms of has he also made NATO weaker? Well, NATO at the end of the day is often discussed really in the context of Article 5, the collective defense clause, that attack on one is attack on all. But that really is founded on an idea of trust. Right? At the end of the day, you can have the most sophisticated militaries, where those militaries are not coming to defense of their partners and allies, then that clause has very little meaning. So I think this is where the soft underbelly of the alliance really is, and this is also where a lot of Europeans are not questioning the US commitment. I would say don't speak things into reality. I think President Trump has said that he's committed to NATO. We haven't seen major US withdrawals yet. Maybe that's still to come, we don't know. Now, we've seen a shift in some allied command structures recently, which I think is actually positive and diversifies responsibility. But certainly I hear a lot of Europeans really question, if there's, let's say, a missile that strikes Estonia or Lithuania, will the US come to NATO's defense? And I think a lot more people now are saying no to that question.
So, and when you speak about the larger threat that Russia presents to Europe, when you look at Ukraine right now, one thing that President Trump has brought to this table is a transactional approach. It's a deal-making approach. It's far less of the rhetoric of its sovereignty at all cost, protecting all of Ukraine for Ukraine. So do you think that has broader ramifications for the sort of shadow war that's happening across the continent?
So I think the mistake that the United States has made, and it's not just this administration, is to really think that Russia's war in Ukraine is about territory. And it's not. And it's first and foremost about the complete subjugation and control of Ukraine. But for the Russians, even that is an access point avenue to the complete weakening of Europe. At the end of the day, that's what Ukraine is, a pathway from the Russian side. That is a clear strategic objective. So of course, as a result, the war has expanded far beyond Ukraine. Now we see what I have called, what SIPA has called, a broad shadow war across the European continent. What is that? It is these kinetic but below threshold threats that we see in almost every European country that were unthinkable before. Jamming of GPS signals of civilian aircraft, critical infrastructure attacks on energy grids, drones surveilling military and civilian infrastructure. And defense by denial has failed, clearly. So Europe really has to understand that this shadow war that Russia has intensified against the entire continent goes hand in glove with Russia's conventional military war in Ukraine, and take it just as seriously as a full kinetic war. Because what this is doing, it's laying down the theater, kind of the phase 0 preparatory theater before you go to conventional strike. And I think once people understand that, the threat becomes far more real.
Yeah, so to that point, so much of that battle is cyber and it's tech-based. Another trend that we're seeing right now is European countries, because of that uncertainty or lack of trust right now in the US, are so-called de-risking themselves when it comes to tech. A push toward digital sovereignty when it comes to cloud, for example. While that may de-risk the day-to-day, do you fear that that also creates vulnerabilities in the overall cybersecurity strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big difference now with the Russian shadow war is that it really has transcended the cyberspace. The tech is an important part of this conversation, but we see sabotage operations, we see assassination attempts. There's a whole slew of kinetic, real physical attacks that are taking place. In this conversation about Europe de-risking from the United States when it comes to all of the services that European countries, consumers, European militaries rely on, cloud being a big one, like the hyperscalers that the U.S. is known for and leads the world in. I think at this point, I don't see a reality in which Europe can achieve what it calls digital sovereignty. Europe doesn't have that capacity, and the reason for that is because Europe has such a fragmented market, right? So companies that could become hyperscalers can't, because they can't scale in Estonia, which is a tech leader. They can't even scale in Germany, right? They move to the US when they want to scale. This is why the US has produced these huge hyperscalers that provide all of these critical services. So when we're talking about de-risking, you have to ask, de-risking to what? Europe can't fill that gap right now with its own enablers, its own champions, unless it does the hard work of economic reform. So who are you going to look like? Well, the options are very limited. And really the only place Europe can look to is China. And I think if we look beyond, the
Which
immediate
creates its
term,
own problems, right?
huge problems,
Yeah.
right? And so I would really think that Europeans need to think more about the long-term threat. Like, what is more strategically problematic? Continuing to rely on U.S. private business, they're still governed by rule of law and transparency, right? Or in the long term, finding yourself completely reliant on Chinese government control providers that have no interest in security, that have no interest in transparency or accountability. I think the choice is pretty clear. And I find it very dangerous that many in Europe are starting to question the very positive economic relationship, despite the political upheavals, of the US-Europe alliance, which is critical to ensure that we don't have a security threat that makes us dependent on China.
I want to come back to Ukraine before we close. So I know that your organization, SIPA, is going to put out next week a new report on Ukraine 2036. This war, while it's created a lot of devastation and economic setback, has also bolstered tech and military within Ukraine. I'm sort of curious, when you look to the long haul, what you see Ukraine bringing to the table in Europe.
So much. I would say three things are top of mind. I mean, one is as Europe struggles to fill its own defense gap, which we were just talking about, and defense industrial surge, capacity development, Ukraine, they're building millions of drones. They have a capacity to do even more. Ukraine can be the defense industrial base for Europe if this is done right, meaning if we think about interoperability. So that's number one. Ukraine can fill that gap that Europe has in some defense capabilities. Number two is on the economic side. EU accession is so important for Ukraine, not just for its own security and economic longevity, but also because it would allow a really standard set of frameworks in the regulatory domain that would, I think, produce a surge in business investment and foreign direct investment as well. Let's be honest, even before the invasion, Ukraine wasn't a hotspot for international business. And that was really because businesses were worried about rule of law. And if that changes now, and we think it will, given the path Ukraine is on, huge opportunities there. Agriculture, chemicals, high tech, human capital is so high in Ukraine. That's a very clear path for Ukraine. And I think lastly, when it comes to what can Ukraine really deliver for Europe besides defense and economic innovation? Well, I mentioned human capital. And like we see so many millions of Ukrainians who've been displaced and are living across Europe, there's all of these interesting numbers that show they're starting businesses, they're entrepreneurs, they're building startups. They are starting to really contribute to the dynamism, not just of Ukraine, but the entire European continent, which Europe sorely needs. So I think when we think about Ukraine's future, it's really about the future of Europe as an economic powerhouse and a future defense player, which it currently isn't.
But do you think it would ever be realistic and on the table that a ceasefire comes, that Putin would agree to a deal that sees Ukraine in EU ascension or joining NATO?
Well, this is the million-dollar question. I mean, certainly the Russians have said absolutely not on NATO, and the Ukrainians have said, well, no NATO right now. But they're not going to agree to no NATO in perpetuity, right? Because that undermines the entire open door policy of the alliance. It's not even about Ukraine at that point. But in terms of EU accession, what's interesting is that the Russians don't care. They don't take the EU very seriously. I think they should, but they don't. So there really was no protest from the Russian side when the EU accession process was open for Ukraine. And I recall very clearly being here in Munich right before the Russian invasion and having a conversation with a German colleague. This is before the military invasion happened. And said, it would be a strong statement if the EU said now that they're going to start the accession process for Ukraine. And my German colleague said, no way, that's not happening. And then it did, right? It should have happened a long time ago. But the Russian side has never responded in any way to countries that seek to join the EU. They don't like it, but at the end of the day, they don't take it seriously because the EU doesn't have a military. And the Russians really only respond to that, which is why NATO has been the big issue for them.
Alina Polyakova, thanks for stopping by.
It's been great to be here.